The sky over the Mediterranean looks calm, but this calm is deceptive. From a distance, everything seems like an ordinary day. The sun is shining, the clouds are thin, the sea glimmers softly under the light. Yet there is an invisible tension in the air, as if the sky itself is about to break apart. Suddenly, gunfire tears through the silence, the sound of metal ripping into metal, the terrifying roar of engines, and within seconds, a confrontation unfolds, one that lasts only moments, but will be written into history for years to come. A Focke-Wulf 190 fighter is caught in an attack it never expected. For a brief instant, the German pilot doesn't even understand what is happening. He sees the aircraft diving from above, but it's already too late, because the enemy plane seems to emerge not from the clouds, but from fate itself. He had never seen a P-40 Warhawk dive from above like this until machine gun fire rips through the fuselage of his aircraft, tearing it apart and forcing it into a spiraling descent toward the villages of Sicily. The body of the plane seems to age within a single minute. Sparks, smoke, shattered metal, wings losing control. The pilot who opened fire was First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, 22 years old, from the town of Brazil, Indiana. That day, he was proving something for the first time. Time in history, this is possible. Because the commanders of the German Luftwaffe were certain of one thing: this is impossible. Why? Because Hall was black. Nazi ideology viewed black people as subhuman. They believed they could not operate complex machinery. They claimed they lacked the courage to fight in combat. But on that day, Hall etched into history what the Nazis had declared impossible. A black pilot had shot down one of their elite fighters. This was not just a single victory. It was more than a battle won in the sky. It was the shattering of a lie that had been built on the ground for years. And this moment was the beginning of the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen. In Nazi Germany, racial doctrine was open and ruthless. Black people were presented as an inferior race, stripped of humanity. Claims that they were intellectually deficient, incapable of understanding technology, and prone to cowardice in battle were part of official propaganda. The Nuremberg laws even banned marriage between Germans and people of African descent. These laws were not merely legal documents, they were a nation killing its own conscience through legislation. But ideology had forgotten one thing. War does not recognize romance, it recognizes results. And in the sky, those who produce results are usually the ones who are most prepared. Over the Mediterranean skies, 992 trained pilots from Tuskegee began dismantling this ideology not with bullets, but with statistics. They were destroying not only German aircraft, but German assumptions. In 1943, when Luftwaffe pilots took to the air to intercept American bombers, they did not know one thing: the men they would face were among the most rigorously trained, most disciplined, and most motivated fighter pilots in the United States Army Air Forces. These pilots, they had not only learned how to fly, they had turned a combat discipline, formation rules, decision-making speed, and the mathematics of air combat into laws of their lives. And their motivation was not just the homeland. They entered battle carrying not only the weight of national duty, but also the burden of proving the capability of an entire race. They knew this. Every mistake would not be seen as the failure of a single pilot, but as a verdict stamped onto an entire people. See, we told you so. When mathematics began to speak in the skies over Europe, the numbers were terrifyingly clear. 15,000 combat sorties, 1,578 combat missions, 112 aerial victories, and most importantly, bomber escort losses far lower than those of other units. These numbers forced even the most fanatical Nazi ideologues to confront the collapse of their racial theories, because this was no longer a battle of ideas. This was reality written daily in the sky, confirmed by iron and fire. But this story did not begin on the battlefield. In truth, the Tuskegee Airmen's first enemy was not the Luftwaffe. Their first enemy was discrimination within America itself. In 1925, the US Army War College published a report titled "The Use of Negro Manpower in War." The sentence written in that report still freezes the blood when read today. Compared to the white man, it must be admitted that he possesses an inferior mentality. He is weak in character by nature. An official document, an official seal, an official insult. This assessment claimed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence for technical roles and were incapable of leadership and courage in combat. And this belief became military policy for many years. But history had already begun to refute these claims. During World War I, Eugene Bullard flew combat missions for France because America would not allow him to fly. In 1921, Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in France because no states would accept her. And in the 1940s, civilian aviation schools in Chicago had already begun training black pilots. Civilian aviation schools had already trained dozens of black pilots. The sky did not recognize race. The problem was not in the sky. The problem was on the ground. As the clouds of war thickened over Europe, pressure for change intensified. Civil rights leaders began knocking on the doors of the military. Walter White of the NAACP, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, Judge William H. Hastie. Meanwhile, black newspapers were bombarding the Roosevelt administration with a single question. If America is fighting for democracy abroad, why is it denying it at home? That question would one day demand an answer, and the name of that answer would be Tuskegee. On April 3rd, 1949, Public Law Number 18 was passed. On paper, it looked like nothing more than a pilot training program. In reality, it was prying loose a bit of rust from a door that had been locked for years. An amendment by Senator Harry H. Schwartz required that the civilian pilot training program include at least one school that would train black pilots. This was not equality. It was a compromise, a concession soaked in discrimination, but it was still a beginning. When Franklin Roosevelt announced his bid for a further term, he needed the votes of black voters in major cities. Politics sometimes moves ahead of conscience, but the result was the same. On January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson announced the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, a flying unit made up entirely of black pilots. But along with the announcement came a warning: this is only an experiment. In other words, let's see if they can do it. Their success was not expected. Some commanders even thought quietly, it would be better if they failed. At the head of this experiment stood one man, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. This experiment stood one man, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the son of America's first black general. For 4 years at West Point, no one spoke to him. Complete silence except for official duties. He had not merely been educated, he had grown his will inside silence. He had grown that will in silence. Now he was carrying hope not just for himself but for 13 million black Americans. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every flight plan he approved revolved around a single question: can we do this? And he knew if this experiment failed, the door could be shut again for future generations. So Davis chose one thing above all else: discipline over emotion, professionalism over anger. because their most powerful weapon paradoxically came before cannons and machine guns perfection. When the 99th Squadron arrived in North Africa, the aircraft at their disposal were already considered outdated. The P-40 Warhawk. It was a rugged aircraft, but in terms of performance, it lagged behind many German fighters. Especially at high altitude and speed, aircraft like the Bf-109 and FW-190 held the advantage. Even so, the Tuskegee pilots had one key edge. They knew exactly how to use the P-40's superior turning ability and durability. They were not given real combat assignments. Commander William Momier sent them on distant patrols, keeping them away from real combat. Some explain this as protection, but in truth, the goal was different. Let them make mistakes. Let it be proven that this won't work. But on June 2nd, 1943, everything changed. The attack on Pantelleria Island. The old P-40s were escorting bombers. These German fighters suddenly appeared. In that moment, the test for the Tuskegee pilots began, and they did one thing right. They did not break formation, because protecting the bombers mattered more than showing heroics. Both sides pressure. Then came July 2nd, 1943. The target was the Castelvetrano airfield in Sicily. 25 bombers were on their way to strike, and 2 F-190s dove toward the bomber formation. Charles Hall moved in. He did not go out hunting for victory. He moved into the gap, into the most dangerous place in the fight. A long burst of fire, and the German fighter slammed into the ground. This was the first aerial victory by a black pilot in US history. But this moment did not exist only in the sky. When they landed, another battle began on the ground. The insults, the mockery, the "you can't do it" that the black ground crews had endured for months fell silent, if only for a moment, because now there was a fact in front of everyone. They had done it. By January 1944, the 99th Squadron had been in combat for 7 months. But the critics did not stop. Commander Momier filed a report claiming they were not aggressive, recommending that the squadron be removed from combat duty. That report traveled upward, reaching General Henry Hap Arnold himself. The experiment was nearing its end, and then Anzio happened. January 27, 1944. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Anzio. The Luftwaffe responded with massed air attacks. Once again, 15 pilots of the 99th Squadron took to the air in outdated P-40s facing superior FW-190s. This was no laboratory experiment. This was bloody reality. Over 2 days, the 99th Squadron shot down multiple enemy aircraft. Sources differ on the exact number, anywhere from 8 to 13. But more important than the number was the image itself, fighting with outdated aircraft against a superior opponent with discipline. In those battles, Charles Hall scored 2 more victories, bringing his total to 3, and in just those 2 days, they destroyed more enemy aircraft than they had in the previous 7 months. Combined, this was no longer luck. This was a system, training, a mindset. The War Department launched an investigation. The 99th Squadron was compared to other P-40 units. The conclusion was clear. They performed just as well as white units. Anzio silenced the critics, because this time it was not opinions that spoke, it was documents. And most importantly, the combatant philosophy of the Tuskegee pilots was taking shape. They understood something essential. The greatest victory is not shooting down the most enemy aircraft. The greatest victory is bringing the bombers you protect safely home. That way of thinking would soon turn them into a legend. In May 1944, the 99th, 100th, 301st and 302nd Squadrons were merged to form the 332nd Fighter Group. This unit was no longer merely a test, it was a real Force, and they were given a mission that would write history to join the 15th Air Force as bomber escorts and carry out long, dangerous missions deep into Nazi Germany. Colonel Benjamin Davis gathered his pilots at the Ramitelli airfield in Italy. He told them a simple but heavy sentence: "Our job is not to hunt. Our job is to bring those bombers home." These words became their combat philosophy. No matter what happens, stay with the bombers. Because the loss of a single bomber was not just the loss of metal. It meant the lives of a 10-man crew. It meant tens of thousands of dollars and a blow to strategic planning. Davis understood this. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining ordered a color identification system for fighter groups. Each group would receive a different color. The 332nd was assigned red, not just the noses, not just the stripes. The entire tails were painted red, and so they became the Red Tails. At first, bomber crews didn't know what it meant. Wander off. They didn't chase the enemy for glory. They didn't abandon their post for heroics. Instead, they stayed over the bombers, forming an invisible shield around them, and this behavior gave birth to a myth among bomber crews. If possible, request the Red Tails, because in those days, what kept you alive was sometimes not your weapon, but who was flying beside you. And with the Red Tails came a promise: "We'll bring you home." July 18th, 1944. The Red Tails faced one of their toughest tests. Colonel Davis led 66 Mustangs to rendezvous with bombers targeting a Luftwaffe base in Memmingen, Germany, to rendezvous with the incoming bombers. The plan was clear: meet the bombers, provide protection, escort them to the target, and bring them back. But the bombers were delayed. That delay created a dangerous gap in the sky. Davis had to make a decision: return to base or orbit and wait over enemy territory. He did not turn back. He waited, because leaving the bombers unprotected would have been a disaster. When the bombers finally appeared, it was as if the sky itself shattered. Approximately 100 German fighters attacked from multiple directions. The Germans now understood one thing: to break the Red Tails' shield, numbers were required. A brutal 20-minute battle erupted. The 332nd Fighter Group scored 11 to 12 aerial victories. But at the same time, 15 B-17 bombers were lost. The 332nd also lost 3 pilots: Robert Hatton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Brown. The critics immediately surfaced. "See, we told you, they couldn't handle major battles." But operational analysis revealed a different truth. The 332nd had been placed in an impossible situation. The bombers were delayed. The Germans were overwhelming in number. Had the Red Tails abandoned the bombers, the losses would have been far worse. They had prevented the catastrophe. Was not proof that they were imperfect, but it was proof that they did not abandon their post. Sometimes heroism is not about shooting down more enemies. Heroism is about not leaving, and that is exactly what the Red Tails did. They stayed. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe's traditional fighter forces could no longer seriously challenge Allied air superiority. But Germany still held one final joker: the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. This aircraft could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour. Against propeller-driven fighters, it seemed almost untouchable. Many pilots described the Me-262 with a simple phrase: "By the time you see it, it's already too late." On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group received its most difficult assignment, a 1,600-mile mission toward Berlin. The target was a strategic industrial facility. Intelligence issued a warning. Jets would be scrambled. Davis led 43 P-51 Mustangs toward the heart of the Reich. As they approached Berlin, the jets suddenly appeared. This may have been the largest concentration of jet fighters ever assembled for a single interception. But the Tuskegee pilots had already studied the weaknesses of jet aircraft. They knew this. Jets were fast but vulnerable in turns, especially after completing an attack and breaking away. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown later explained their tactics. "We didn't chase them straight from behind. We pulled away and then turned into their blind spots." The result: 3 jet fighters shot down in a single engagement, more than many fighter groups achieved throughout the entire war. In one afternoon, the Red Tails surpassed the total number of previous American victories over the Mi-262. This was no longer just a victory. It was the symbol of an era. Proof that what was called impossible could be made possible. Airmen is not made of victories alone. They suffered losses as well. 32 pilots were captured, 66 were killed in combat. Even more were lost in training and non-combat missions. War tested everyone with the same pain. When Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was taken prisoner, he noticed a bitter irony. In Nazi prison camps, he was sometimes treated more equally than he would later be in his own country. When the war ended and he returned to America, discrimination greeted him once again. This is one of the most painful truths of the story. A man who fought fascism abroad still had to face prejudice at home, but the statistics did not change. The Tuskegee Airmen flew hundreds of missions, completed thousands of combat sorties, achieved 112 aerial victories, and destroyed 150 enemy aircraft on the ground. And most importantly, bombers under their escort suffered significantly fewer losses to enemy fighters, 27, compared to an average of 46 in other units. These numbers are not empty praise. They are a real record of protection. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed the executive order to desegregate the US military. The performance of the Tuskegee Airmen was one of the factual pillars that strengthened the ideological foundation of that decision. Benjamin Davis would later become the first black general in the US Air Force. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. At that time, only about 300 of the original pilots were still alive. Some had waited more than 60 years for national recognition. They did not fight only the Germans. They fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and they won all 3 wars. Because in the end, one truth remained. The color of a pilot's skin does not determine his ability to fly or fight, and that is what changed history. Yet, the true legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, statistics, kill counts, or red-painted tails. Their greatest victory did not happen in the sky. It happened in the human mind, because after the war, it wasn't only the structure of the Air Force that changed. The way people thought changed. Slowly, painfully, with resistance, but irreversibly. The Tuskegee pilots proved that discrimination is not only morally wrong, it is strategically foolish. To discard talent based on skin color is to choose weakness in war. America learned this lesson late, but it learned it, and that lesson spread beyond the military, into society itself. After the war, many Tuskegee pilots struggled to return to quiet civilian lives. Some could not find work as pilots. Some became instructors. Others left aviation entirely. They had risked their lives in the sky yet on the ground. They were still treated as second-class citizens. This paradox remains one of America's deepest contradictions. A nation that defeated fascism abroad yet still struggled to fully embrace equality at home had not yet fully embraced equality but time was on the side of the Tuskegee Airmen. When the civil rights movement rose in the 1950s and 1960s, their story had already become living proof. Behind Martin Luther King Jr.'s struggle with words stood a history written by the Tuskegee pilots with bullets. They had shown that the people once labeled not ready were, in truth, simply denied opportunity. Today, thousands of black pilots serve in the United States Air Force. Many of them did not learn the name Tuskegee from history books, but from family stories, because this legacy lives not in official documents, but in a pride passed from generation to generation. The red tails no longer fly across the sky, but their mark remains on every runway. The Tuskegee Airmen left us a lesson. Sometimes history's greatest revolutions are made not with slogans, but with discipline. Not with shouting, but with silent excellence. They did not say we can do this too, they simply did it. And that was more destructive to false theories than any argument could ever be. History is sometimes written with the sound of cannons, sometimes with the roar of propellers, but the history of the Tuskegee Airmen was written differently, like a lie, disproven in silence. They were told, you cannot fly. They flew. They were told, you are unfit for combat. They protected. They were told, this is impossible. They changed history. And in the end, one truth remained. The sky has never recognized race. Prejudice has always been created by those on the ground.